That's okay. I'm just trying to
It's like
synchronize
a
watches.
referee on the field. Boys, don't worry about that clock. I got the clock.
I'm trying to synchronize my watch here because that thing.
2 minutes till 7.
You know, it's a shame that we can't get a clock up there that you don't keep time.
You can't buy it.
Good morning. Glad to see everybody here this morning. We're studying in Ruth, the second chapter. And if you'll remember last Sunday, Ruth was out in the field and she was having a pretty good day, and probably did better than anybody else out there other than the regular reapers. And they fed her good, and she worked hard, and she had a whole lot to show for her work. And today, when we pick up, we're going to start with verse 19, where she comes home and shows Naomi all the things that she has accomplished in that day. And of course, Naomi's going to be very impressed, and we're going to kind of move on. We'll finish chapter 2, and I'm sure we'll move into chapter 3 before we finish the day. So before we go any further, I'd like for Doc Akers, if he would, to lead our minds in prayer.
Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this day that we had the help to come out and simply hear and listen to your word. Help us, Heavenly Father, to understand the things that are being said today and in some way apply it from our lives, that we could live stronger Christian lives in your sight. Pray that you be with David as he teaches this class, and give him a recollection of the things he has said, and speak to us in a way that we can understand all of these things. We give you thanks for Jesus. In his name we do these things and pray. Amen.
All right, so let's start here with verse 19. It says, "And her mother-in-law said unto her, Where hast thou gleaned today? And where wrougest thou? Blessed be he that did taketh knowledge of thee. And she showed her mother-in-law with whom she had wrought, and said, The man's name with whom I wrought today is Boaz." So Naomi, she had to be pretty curious about what was going on here, because normally when people of that state go out and glean in the field, they don't bring back a whole lot. It's pretty much hand to mouth, maybe enough for that day, maybe not even enough for that day. So here comes Ruth back with all this grain and all these other things, and Naomi's pretty impressed, and she wants to know, what part of the field did you work that you get this type of yield? And now, obviously, Naomi didn't suspect that Ruth had done this in some type of illicit manner, or done something that she shouldn't have done. But I think she's kind of looking here that she was directed to this field and getting the harvest that she got that day by the providence of God. That God sent her to a really good spot and put her in a good situation to do the gleaning that she needed to do, and just wanted to know a little bit more about it, because this was kind of an unusual situation. Maybe did somebody help you out in this deal? We really don't know exactly what the conversation was, but I think we get the gist of it here. So she asked the same question. Probably in a couple of words, how did you do this? And obviously, Ruth had worked hard, and Naomi recognized the hard work that she did in the field that day to get all these these ears of corn that, that she had for that day, because I would suspect that probably getting a whole ear of corn in that situation was probably pretty unusual for somebody who was doing, gleaning and just kind of picking up what was left around the side. So Naomi knew by the quantity that somebody had to have helped her out in this deal, because it was such an unusual situation. So, Ruth obviously gave credit to the person who helped her out and named his name as Boaz. Now, I'm sure that Naomi, or that Ruth, gave the whole story to Naomi, and of course, obviously, named Boaz as the person that helped him. So this was something that was familiar to Naomi, and we're going to see here that this is going to start ringing some bells, and we're going to start moving into the situation where there becomes a relationship between Ruth and Boaz. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 20. And Naomi said unto her daughter-in-law, Blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi said unto her, The man is nigh of kin unto us, one of our near kinsmen. So we see here that Naomi, prays for a blessing on Boaz for the kindness that he has shown, both in a temporal manner and also kind of in a spiritual manner, to Ruth, and she wants him to be blessed for the good works that he has shown. And he talks about to the living and the dead. Of course, the living is Naomi and Ruth, but the dead would be their husbands, and showing respect for them, for their husbands, through the way that he treated them. So Boaz had been some type of kin to Elimelech and to his sons. Of course, obviously they were now dead, and he continues this relationship and his kindness to the relief that he's showing to Naomi and Ruth, who were living, and he was kind to them as respect for their dead husbands. And this is showing a very good respect for their memory. And there's a lesson there for us, that the people that we respect, and when they pass on, we need to show kindness to their families and things along that line, because that's a matter of showing our respect for them. It's kind of like when you go to a funeral home. Really, you're showing respect for the one that has died, but also you're showing respect for the family also, and thinking about their well-being, because once somebody dies, there's not a whole lot you can do for them, but there's a lot of things that you can do for their family. So Ruth and Naomi were living, and they were also representatives of Elimelech and Mahlon, and who were dead. They were the survivors. And Naomi was of the family, and Ruth was not really of the family, but she was through marriage. She was an in-law. So it appears here that Naomi was a direct relation to Boaz, whereas Ruth was a relation by marriage, and was a representative of Mahlon, who was obviously some type of direct relation to Boaz. So the phrase here, one of our next kinsmen, was in the original text, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the word in the original text because it's about that long. But the word in the original text means redeemer, and that's important in this deal, because Boaz is looked as a redeemer, and there's where the parallel comes in between Christ and Boaz, is that Boaz was a redeemer for Naomi and Ruth, and Christ is our redeemer, and we see this word used a lot in the ancient text. Guardian redeemer.
Of course, a lot of the basis for what Boaz is doing is covered in the 25th chapter of Leviticus, 25 through 55, and it doesn't get into romance.
it's not, it's,
Basically, it talks about property, it talks about debts, and I mean, it's quite detailed, and obviously, that was the motivation that Boaz had her, because he saw through Naomi and Ruth that, you know, he needed to step up and be a guardian redeemer for them.
right, and according to the law, he had to do that. Because
He
this,
knew Naomi, but he didn't know Ruth, except for what people were saying,
right.
that Ruth did all this stuff for Naomi, right?
So this Redeemer is the one who has the right to redeem the forfeited inheritance of the family, because, you know, they basically lose this stuff unless there was somebody to come in and redeem it for them. Now the word Goel, which is Goel, signifies a near kinsman, one who by the Masonic law had the right to redeem an inheritance and also was permitted to vindicate or revenge the death of his relations by killing the slayer if he was found outside of a city of refuge. Now, if you'll remember, we talked, you know, when we were studying in the Old Testament, we talked about a city of refuge where a criminal could go and he would be safe. And if, you know, obviously the kinsman could not go into that city of refuge and kill the slayer, but if he caught him outside, he was pretty much fair game. So in order to prevent families from running into decay, if a brother dies childless, the next unmarried brother would take the widow and the children from that marriage that were reputed the children of the deceased brother. And there was basically three things in this office that the next of kin had to do. The first one, it belonged to him to buy back the forfeited inheritance or the liberty of him who had been obligated to sell himself as a servant. The second thing, it was his right to avenge the blood of any of the family who had been killed by killing the murderer. And third, it belonged to him to take the widow of a deceased brother or relative if he died childless. So, we have to kind of put ourselves back in that time. They didn't have welfare and all the kind of stuff that we got going on now. You know, when a husband died, the widow was pretty much destitute, and you had to depend on other people, or they were going to have a really terrible life and pretty much live hand to mouth, and maybe not even have a shelter over there.
David, it was that way here until the 19th century.
Well, yeah,
That
yeah.
changed.
So if the nearest of kin in any case refused, he was treated as an indigent, and somebody who was just pretty low, and they if they had any integrity, they pretty much lost it by their act there. They lost the right to the inheritance, and the next of kin to him might come forward and take the widow. And this is the case of Boaz. Now we're going to discover that in the line of succession, as it were, Boaz was not the first one in line. There was another kinsman that was actually a closer relative, but he wasn't going to step up. So Boaz, being the next one in line, was the one who was going to step up.
Most writers say that this responsibility fell to Naomi.
Mm-hmm.
So she was the one that should have been the married partner. So
Right.
this was all for, like you said a while ago, keeping the clan going.
Right.
She was past childbearing age.
Right.
So she passed that to Ruth.
Right. And there's where you see the providence in
Right.
it. Any other comments? All right, let's go to verse 21. And Ruth the Moabitess said, Yea, he said unto me, Thou shalt keep fast by my young men until they have ended all my harvest. So besides the favors that Boaz had already showed Ruth, he gave some reason here that there was a little bit more to expect, and Ruth needed to stay close to him and stay away from his reapers and stay a little bit closer to him until the barley harvest and the wheat harvest was finished. We're just talking here about the first harvest. There was another harvest that was going to come, and apparently Ruth had caught Boaz's eye a little bit, and he says, you know what? you need to stay around me. Just those other guys, let's stay away from them a little bit. We're seeing just a little bit of attraction here, as it were, for Ruth by Boaz. So Boaz he was going to keep her close and make sure that she only gleaned in his fields as long as the harvest had lasted. Now the word in the original text was hanarim, which is translated servants, and this is both male and female that's included in this. Now the Septuagint version talks about with my maidens, which agrees with Ruth 2:8, where the order of Boaz is expressed. So he is being very careful here not to do things that would be looked upon as being brash, but he's having her stay with his group of maidens, not necessarily with him, as it were, physically being in his presence all the time. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 22. And Naomi said unto Ruth her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his maidens, and that they meet thee not in any other field. So Naomi declares her full satisfaction with the situation at hand and the way that it's being handled with Ruth. And it's important for Ruth to have a good reputation with the people around, because she was a Moabite. And Moabites weren't very well respected, among the Jews. So Naomi here was thinking about Ruth's reputation, and she didn't want her to get in a situation where people were going to insult her, treat her bad, and things along that line. If she had done that in a strange field or somebody else's field where she would go gleaning, she might have that problem. Even maybe to the point where somebody would kill her because they did not like Moabites. And, back in that day and time, and even still sometimes in the Middle East today, life doesn't mean anything to those people. And it might not only be a matter of verbal insults, but some type of physical harm that might come along with it too.
They wouldn't let Moses and Aaron pass through Moab.
Right.
When they were coming to the promised land, so
There's a little bit of hate there, I think we could say. So a prudent recommendation to Ruth, and to accept the generous invitation of Boaz, that she stay in his fields and stay along around his people, was going to be a good thing. And of course, obviously, this was going to please him, and from a selfish standpoint, it was going to be better for both of them, because they were going to be able to take advantage of the liberality that Boaz was showing as far as giving food and things along that line. And moreover, you can kind of observe that the old matron had already discerned in all of Boaz's attention that there was maybe some germs being planted here of a stronger type of affection, which it wouldn't be Naomi wouldn't be too unhappy if this increased and it grew into something pretty good. And so let's go into verse 23. So she kept fast by the maidens of Boaz to glean into the end of the barley harvest and of the wheat harvest, and she dwelt with her mother-in-law. So she continued here to accept the kindness of Boaz, but also she was attending to the advice of her mother-in-law by doing the things that her mother-in-law had told her to do, and by doing all this diligence, they were going to have a pretty good livelihood between the two of them for the things that Ruth had done. And Ruth, her humility that she showed, the industry that she showed, that she should continue to do that. And I would suspect that probably somewhere along the line, Naomi was thinking, kind of like Phil said, I'm too old to have kids, and this is an opportunity for the family to continue through Ruth. So she would continue to practice until the wheat harvest was finished, which would begin around the day of Pentecost on the Jewish candle. Now the barley and the corn, started around the Passover time. So according to the Midrash, this is one of the old ancient texts and kind of like a commentary, from the beginning of one to the end of the other was about 3 months. And though it may be they were gathered in sooner, from the Passover and the Pentecost, there was kind of a 7-week period, between there, and which was the difference between the beginning of one harvest and the beginning of the other. And harvest time was a very important time back in that day, and there was a lot of work to it, and you had to prepare for it, and because this was basically the only opportunity that they had to bring in this type of food. It's not like it is now. You don't go down to the grocery store and get what you want. Everything was pretty much handmade back in that time. So Ruth continued to dwell with her mother-in-law, which is understood either her coming home at night, and after she had gleaned all day, lodged with her mother-in-law, which is pretty much consistent with the custom of that time. And she did not stay with Boaz and his people. At night she continued to come home and take care of her mother-in-law Naomi. Comments about that verse. All right, let me do a little bit of modern technology here, and we'll move on to chapter 3.
Get a little serious here, chapter.
Yeah. All right, chapter 3, verse 1. And Naomi, her mother-in-law, said unto her, My daughter, I shall not seek rest for thee, that it may be well with thee. So after the harvests were over and the gleaning was done, and when Naomi and Ruth were alone together in their apartment or their dwelling or wherever they were living, Naomi and Ruth, they're starting to have a little conversation here about the future and what's to come. So Naomi had figured out that Boaz might be kind of taking a liking to Ruth, and that was okay with her, and she didn't want to get in the way of this deal. Now, she has always wanted Ruth to find her a husband to marry and to have a life of her own, and that speaks well of Naomi, because it would have been very easy for Naomi to say, well, I've got it made now. I got somebody that's going out there bringing me food. I'm getting old here. And I'd like to be waited on for the rest of my life by my daughter-in-law. But that was not the way that Naomi was thinking. She respected Ruth, thought a lot of her, and obviously loved her and wanted her to have a happy life of her own, and knew that she wasn't going to be able to give it to her. So now Naomi is kind of offering to take matters into her own hands and help find Ruth a husband. And you know what? I think she had one in mind at this particular point. So it's time for her to have her own house and her own life and a husband to support her. And Naomi did not want Ruth to have to work herself to death to support both of them for the rest of Naomi's life, and then the rest of the time that Ruth would have left also. So the interrogation carries it in the force of a strong affirmation, and may suggest that she judged it to be her duty, and that she was determined to seek out such an arrangement for Ruth. And in the original text, we see some pretty strong language and more like an insistence on this type of deal. Now the Targum makes her way speaking as a strong-willed woman, and the Targum says that she took an oath not to until she had found Ruth a husband. And of course the Targum is kind of a commentary on the Old Testament. Comments about that verse. All right, let's move on to verse 2. And now is there not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maidens thou wast, behold, he winneth barley tonight in the threshing floor. So Boaz was a kinsman, just as her question supposed and concluded. And Naomi is making the observation so that Ruth might take notice of it and get some encouragement from the things that, she is saying as far as the relationship with Boaz. And Ruth had been admitted into the company and conversation of the maidens, and which there was a lot more. And though it's not mentioned to the company and the conversation of Boaz, there was probably some conversation among the maidens of Boaz that, with Ruth, that, hey, Boaz is kind of taking a liking to you. Now, with not wanting to get attacked here, women talk and do stuff like that, okay? And men do the same thing too, okay? But
You can't hide it.
you can't hide it. You got to kind of get it. You got to kind of get into the group, and groups have a tendency to talk a little bit. And
Boaz is looking at her and looking over.
well, and the other thing too, we don't know anything about this group of maidens. There may be a couple maidens in that group that had their eye on Boaz too. So there may have been a little bit of, there may have been a little jealousy here in this deal, especially because Ruth was a Moabite. So
It was probably a good catch.
oh yeah, and obviously Naomi knew it, and I think Ruth was kind of humble in the deal. That maybe she had a little lower opinion of herself than some of the other persons. And there's nothing wrong with being humble, and but you might want to be a fly on the wall listening to the conversation that was going on there. So Naomi was thinking that Boaz, the next kinsman, could be obligated by law to marry Ruth. This maybe was in her mind also. Now, the law did not allow the widow to marry a stranger. So it would have to be a situation where there would have to be some type of kinsman or relationship along the line down through there for this to be, legal. And I'm sure that Boaz was, knew what the law was, and obviously he knew what his obligation was, and we've seen this already, based on the way that he has honored Naomi and Ruth. So Naomi here sees an opportunity to get Ruth and Boaz together. She's gonna play matchmaker here just a little bit. And this verse also reveals some qualities of Boaz and the simple manners of Boaz and his times, that they see. So I mean, he was an upright guy, and obviously he was a good businessman, and he did things the right way. He had compassion, and was generally a good guy. But we also know here that he was a mighty man of wealth, and this assists the personality or him out there personally when they're out there working. He could have very well stayed home, sent one of his foremen out there to do the work. That's not how he did business. He was out there in the field, personally supervising that. They call that leading from the front. And that's the kind of guy that, that Boaz was. He was out there leading by and setting an example for his people that, he thought enough about them to be out there and assisting them. And I can imagine that if there was times where, he needed to pitch in and help, I could imagine, based on what I've read, that, he wasn't allergic to getting his hands dirty, also. So, there was a lot of things that were involved in this, and he was out there supervising all of it. He had to gather it in, you had to take it back, you had to process it, you had to put it in whatever container that it was going to be in, and protect it from the things that could happen to it, and even thievery and things along that line. So the process is performed by you throw the grain up in the air, and after it's trodden down, and the wind kind of takes the excess away, and you get the grain on the ground. And like I say, it has to be picked up and all of that. And normally they did it with a shovel. You take and they throw it up in the air kind of work from there. You probably had to do it, a couple times. I don't think I've ever done that. The thrashing floor which was commonly on the harvest field, was carefully leveled with a large roller. And they had, they didn't just do it on the ground. This was a pretty solid area when they did it. And I'm told that it was kind of marked off with chalk. And one of the reasons that they put this chalk on there was to keep the weeds from springing up on it, so that that the grain wouldn't get lost in the weeds. And this was a process that was taken care of pretty dutifully. And it was also usually a high spot in the area where they did this. And while they did that was, the high spots where you're going to have the best wind. If you did it down in the valley, you may not get the wind and stuff to do the process. And sometimes we think that we've got all this great technology and stuff, that these people back in this time were stupid. They weren't stupid. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they were very ingenious by the way that they did things, because they didn't have the technology that that we have today. So the farmer usually remained all night in the harvest time on the threshing floor, not only to protect his grain, but also the area that was where it was being processed. And the operation was performed in the evening to catch the breezes which blow after the close of the hot day, which continue most of the part of the night. And Jeff will probably know this, but Frazier would, when he was over in Kuwait, would call us, and it would be nighttime there, and you could actually hear the breeze. And he said, "Oh yeah, man, it's great. It's 96 degrees, but there's a cool breeze blowing off the Gulf." And this is the same type of area that we're talking about here. And at night there was kind of a breeze there to do it. So in the evening they got the sea breeze, and which was common in Palestine. It took the place only in the evening. So and the other thing you got to think about too, they didn't have lighting and things like that. All these things had to be done at a particular time of day to be able to take advantage of the weather conditions and the lighting and all that type of thing.
You can't have torches either because it's highly flammable.
Yeah, set the field on fire. That's what they need. So this duty is so important this season that the master undertakes it himself, and accordingly laid down to sleep on the barn floor at the end of a heap of barley. So Boaz, he stayed out there all the time, not only to supervise, but also to protect his crop. So this was a good time to get Boaz and Ruth together and spend some quality time together. Naomi, she was on this. She was on this deal. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 3. It says, "Wash thyself therefore, and anoint thee, and put on thy raiment upon thee, and get thee down to the threshing floor, but make not thyself known to the man until he shall have done eating and drinking." So, here Naomi is telling Ruth, get yourself cleaned up, get you some decent clothes on, and go down there where Boaz is at. But don't let him see you right now, because, it's not time. Let him eat and let him drink and let him, relax a little bit before you move in. Okay.
And if you thought Naomi had some bad motives here, you might have thought that she was telling Ruth to park herself up.
A little bit there, yeah. But you know what though? I mean, the hygiene in that day and time was very important. I mean, these people worked all day. It was nasty work, and I can imagine what they came home looking like and smelling like at the end of the day. So probably you might not even want to be in the same room with them just to eat, yet alone to have some type of conversation and some personal time together. So she wanted it to at least smell good and look good for Boaz in this deal, and make herself acceptable, because she's out there, she's got some competition, So she wants to, do the best that she can. And, Naomi is, she's really, she wants this to happen.
One of the old writers said, of course, it was all through God's providence.
Right.
So, but they didn't know really Boaz, what
Right.
type of man he was.
Right.
He said his wife was to put the spark and the tinder together, in an instant like this,
Right.
and not knowing,
Right.
and said that the way that she was cleaning herself up, it would make her known that her days of mourning the loss of her husband
Mm-hmm.
was over.
Good
And
point.
she was ready to engage in another marriage.
Right.
So it was all, could have been a lot worse situation, but
Right.
God knew.
And again, you cannot read this book without seeing the providence of God in there. Getting everything, everything lined up the way that it needed to be. So it was supposed that Ruth was not anointed with these aromatic ointments because probably they couldn't afford it. That stuff, it's just like today, you get a really expensive perfume and, that stuff ain't cheap. And probably they couldn't afford something like that, but it was some type of anointing that Naomi and Ruth could, that they could afford. So rather than a common old Ruth being a poor widow, she might, use olive oil or something like that. But the point of the deal, and this was in one of the commentaries, was to make Ruth look sleek and smooth. And it's kind of like when you put an oil on, it kind of gives your skin a glisten or something like that. And we want her to present herself in as nicest manner as possible here. So Naomi also told Ruth to put on her best raiment. Put on your best dress that you've got for this situation. So there is no indication that Ruth didn't have some good clothes in this deal. Now the Targum indicates that Naomi advises her to put off her widow's weed the time of mourning for her husband, and perhaps put on some type of ornamental dress like Philip was talking about, to show that she had finished her time of mourning and was now ready to move on with her life, and maybe advertise a little bit that she was looking for a husband in this situation. And and the thing about it is, this is not a deal where she's doing something in an immodest way. This can be done in a very dignified way, and that is not immodest. And I don't think that we can read anything into this that they were trying to do something that was immodest. I think that this was done in good taste and all of that. And and the thing about it is, probably with Boaz, he would probably be turned off by somebody that came in and looked like a streetwalker. So you've got to consider what would be pleasing to Boaz and to Boaz also. Also, some of the ancient commentators interpret this as being her Sabbath day clothes, or as we would call it, the Sunday go to meeting stuff, or the Saturday best. That type of situation. So Naomi tells Ruth to go to the threshing floor where she knew that Boaz was working, and which we know, or we suppose, was in the lower end of the city of Bethlehem. Now some understand it that she should not make herself known to any man, and not to any of the servants of Boaz who thought they maybe knew him before. And this was kind of a habit of the gleaners. They all kind of knew each other, and she might stick out a little bit, the way that she was dressed versus the way that the people were dressed that were there doing the work. So we'll pick up there next week and see where this romance leads to.